Imagine a man whose name became synonymous with cunning political strategy, a thinker whose ideas continue to shape power dynamics even centuries after his death. That man is Niccolo Machiavelli, a political philosopher and diplomat from Renaissance Italy, best known for his controversial work, The Prince. But who was Machiavelli really, and why was The Prince so distasteful that it was banned in the Catholic Church for over 200 years? In this video, you'll hear his life story told from his own perspective, from his early years in Florence, through political exile, and the writing of The Prince, all in his own words. So, sit back as Machiavelli himself reveals the man behind the legend. I was born on May 3rd, 1469, in the heart of Florence, a city that was bustling with culture, intellect, and power struggles. My family, though of noble lineage, was not wealthy. My father Bernardo was a lawyer, but we had long fallen from the height of influence that some of our ancestors had enjoyed. Still, my father was a man of books, and he ensured I had access to a solid education despite our modest means. I was surrounded by the wisdom of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and from a young age I immersed myself in history, politics, and the philosophies that shaped human governance. Florence, during my youth, was in constant turmoil, a city-state ruled by the powerful Medici family, who had grown their influence through banking. Yet the political landscape was always shifting, with various factions vying for control. I grew up in a time when Italy was not a unified country, but a series of independent city-states, all jockeying for power, while larger powers like France and Spain hovered over us, waiting to assert their influence. It was a world where power was fragile, and alliances shifted like sand. By the time I was in my mid-20s, Florence had seen its share of upheaval. The Medici were overthrown after Charles VIII of France invaded Italy. The French arrival, combined with discontent among the Florentine people, led to the rise of the radical Dominican friar, Savonarola. He was a fiery preacher, condemning the corruption of the church and the moral decay of the city. Under his influence, Florence became a theocratic republic for a few years. I remember walking the streets and witnessing the bonfire of the vanities, where books, art, and cosmetics were burned in Savonarola's name. It was as if Florence had been overtaken by a fever of religious zeal, but that fever soon broke. In 1498, Savonarola was excommunicated and executed for heresy, marking yet another shift in power in my turbulent city. That same year, I decided enough was enough and found myself thrust into politics. At the age of 29, I was appointed as second Chancellor of the Florentine Republic, a position I held with great pride. I was responsible for overseeing many internal affairs, but perhaps the most valuable experience I gained during this time came from my diplomatic missions. I traveled extensively, representing Florence in the courts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Papal States. I had the privilege of observing powerful men up close, and through them, I began to understand the harsh realities of power and governance. I met with Cesare Borgia, a man who had a profound impact on my thinking. Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, was a ruthless and pragmatic ruler. His methods, though brutal, were undeniably effective, and I admired the way he consolidated power. His actions were a lesson in political survival, and I would later reflect on his tactics when I wrote The Prince. During my years in office, I grew increasingly convinced that Florence's reliance on mercenaries to defend the city was a mistake. Mercenaries fought for money, not loyalty, and I believed that a citizen militia would be far more effective in protecting our republic. I worked tirelessly to reform the military, and for a time it seemed that Florence might indeed be able to stand on its own. But my efforts were cut short when, in 1512, the Medici returned to power. With the help of Pope Julius II, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, who would soon become Pope Leo X, overthrew the Republican government, and I found myself on the wrong side of history. I was dismissed from office, accused of conspiracy against the Medici, and subjected to torture. They applied the strappado, a particularly cruel method in which I was suspended by my arms, dislocating my shoulders. Yet despite the pain, I refused to confess to crimes I did not commit. So eventually they had to let me go, but I knew from that moment forward, my life in politics was over. I retreated to my estate in Sant'Andrea in Percosina, just outside of Florence. There, in the quiet of the countryside, I began to write. It was during these years of exile that I penned my most famous work, The Prince. I wrote it as a gift to the Medici, hoping that it would restore me to favor and allow me to return to public life. The prince was not meant to be a manifesto for tyranny, as some interpreted it, but rather a realistic examination of power. In it, I argued that the ends often justify the means, that a ruler must be willing to do whatever is necessary to maintain his state. I based much of my writing on the examples of leaders I had observed, men like Caesar Borgia, who used cruelty, deceit, and cunning to achieve their goals. Yet, despite my efforts, the Medici never welcomed me back. The prince remained unpublished during my lifetime, and I remained in political exile. But my pen was not idle. During these years, I also wrote discourses on Livy, in which I laid out my thoughts on republican government. Unlike The Prince, which focused on the rule of a single leader, Discourses was a tribute to the republican ideals I had always believed in, ideals that placed power in the hands of the people rather than in the grasp of a single ruler. I also dabbled in comedy with my play Mandragola, which, to my surprise, became quite popular. It was a satire on the corruption and foolishness of men, something I had seen plenty of in my political career. As the years passed, I never gave up my desire to return to public life, though the opportunity never came. I continued to write, producing works like Florentine Histories, where I chronicled the history of my beloved city, and The Art of War, a treatise on military strategy. But Florence was not kind to me. In 1527, the Medici were once again overthrown, and a new republican government was established. For a brief moment, I thought I might be called back to service, but fate had other plans. I fell ill and died shortly after, in June of that same year, at the age of 58. Looking back on my life, I find it filled with irony. I, Niccolo Machiavelli, spent my years studying power, advising leaders, and trying to shape the fate of my city. Yet I died in obscurity, having never achieved the political success I so desired. But I do not consider myself a failure. My writings, especially The Prince, have outlived me, continuing to influence thinkers, politicians, and rulers centuries after my death. My legacy, it seems, is not in the power I wielded during my life, but in the ideas I left behind. In the end, I learned that power is a fleeting thing. It can be won, but it can also be lost in the blink of an eye. What remains, however, are the lessons we leave for others. I leave you with this thought: the world is not black and white, and neither are the men who govern it. Power requires flexibility, pragmatism, and sometimes the willingness to act in ways that others might deem immoral. But as I wrote in The Prince, it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. Such is the nature of power.